March 1948. The restaurant on Mulberry Street occupied the ground floor of a brick building that had stood since before the century turned. Red and white check tablecloths covered 20 tables. The walls were painted cream, decorated with photographs of Sicily and Rome. At 11:30 on a Tuesday morning, the lunch crowd had not yet arrived. The dining room held only 6 men seated at a corner table near the kitchen, their voices low, their gestures minimal. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson sat at this table, the only black man in the room. He wore a charcoal suit recently pressed and a dark blue tie. At 42 years old, his reputation in Harlem was substantial. He controlled the numbers racket throughout the neighborhood, employed several hundred people in various capacities, and maintained working relationships with the Italian families who controlled organized crime throughout New York. These relationships, built carefully over the previous decade, allowed him to operate with relative autonomy while paying appropriate tribute to the larger structure. The meeting had been called to discuss distribution arrangements for heroin coming into New York from Europe. The product arrived through various channels, some legitimate, some clandestine, all carefully managed by the Italian families who controlled the importation networks. The purpose of this meeting was to determine how the product would move from the ports through the city to the various retail operations that sold to users. Vincent Gallo, who represented the Genovese family's interests in narcotics, spread a hand-drawn map across the table. The map showed the New York waterfront, the major trucking routes through the city, and the neighborhoods where distribution would occur. Gallo was 51 years old, a man who had survived 3 decades in organized crime by being methodical and careful. He traced a route with his finger. Product would arrive at piers on the west side, concealed in legitimate cargo. From there, trucks would transport it to warehouses in the Bronx and Brooklyn. These warehouses would serve as distribution hubs, breaking down large shipments into smaller packages for street-level operations. From the warehouses, the product would move to various neighborhoods, including Harlem, through a network of smaller distributors. Johnson studied the map. The route Gallo described made logical sense from a security standpoint. It minimized exposure, reduced the number of transfers, and kept the product moving through areas where the Italian families had strong police and political connections. But it also bypassed Harlem entirely during the most vulnerable stages of the operation. The trucks carrying product from the ports to the warehouses would travel through Midtown Manhattan or up the East Side. They would avoid Harlem's streets. The warehouses that would serve as distribution hubs were located in the Bronx and Brooklyn, not in Harlem itself. By the time product reached Harlem, it would be in small quantities, already broken down and packaged for street sales. This meant that Harlem would see none of the economic activity associated with the early stages of distribution, the trucking jobs, the warehouse positions, and the logistics coordination that represented significant employment and revenue. All of this would occur elsewhere. Harlem would receive only the final product and the street-level sales operations, the most visible and most vulnerable part of the entire chain. Johnson understood the implications immediately. This arrangement would generate millions of dollars in economic activity, but almost none of it would flow through Harlem. The Italian families would control all the high-value functions: importation, transportation, wholesale distribution, while Harlem's role would be limited to retail sales, the lowest margin and highest risk part of the business. Gallo finished explaining the route and looked around the table. The other men nodded their approval. The system was clean, efficient, and secure. It minimized risk while maximizing profit for those who controlled the operation. Johnson said nothing. He studied the map for another moment, then leaned back in his chair. He had not been invited to this meeting to negotiate. He had been invited to receive information about decisions that had already been made. His presence was a courtesy, an acknowledgment of his position in Harlem, but not a recognition of any authority to influence these arrangements. Gallo rolled up the map. Someone made a comment about lunch. The meeting was ending. Johnson stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and shook hands with each man at the table. His expression remained neutral. His voice, when he spoke, was polite and measured. He thanked them for including him in the discussion, and he said he looked forward to working within whatever arrangements they established. Then he walked out of the restaurant into the March morning. The air was cold, carrying the smell of exhaust and baking bread from a nearby bakery. He walked north on Mulberry Street, turned west on Houston, and continued walking until he reached a subway station. He descended the stairs, paid his fare, and took the train north to Harlem. During the 40-minute subway ride, Johnson's expression did not change. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, his eyes focused on nothing in particular. Around him, the subway car filled and emptied as the train moved through the city. He appeared to be a man simply riding the train home, thinking about nothing more important than what he might have for dinner. But his mind was working through what he had learned, or examining it from multiple angles, understanding not just the immediate implications, but the larger system it represented. This was not about Vincent Gallo personally. This was not even about the specific route that had been outlined. This was about power structures and how they determined the distribution of economic opportunity. The Italian families controlled the importation and wholesale distribution of heroin because they controlled the infrastructure that made such operations possible. They had connections at the ports where dock workers and inspectors could be paid to look the other way. They controlled trucking companies that could move product without arousing suspicion. They owned warehouses where large quantities could be stored and processed. And they had relationships with police and politicians that allowed them to operate with relative impunity. Harlem had none of this infrastructure under its own control. The docks were Italian territory. The trucking unions were Italian-controlled. The warehouses capable of handling large-scale operations were located in neighborhoods where Italians held power. And the police and political connections necessary to protect such operations belonged primarily to the Italian families. This meant that any route designed for security and efficiency would naturally flow through Italian-controlled infrastructure, bypassing Harlem except as a final destination for product distribution. It was not personal, it was structural. The system had been built to serve those who controlled the underlying infrastructure, and when Harlem did not control that infrastructure. Understanding this distinction was crucial. If Johnson treated this as a personal slight, he might react emotionally, demanding inclusion or threatening disruption, but such reactions would be ineffective because they would not address the underlying problem. The Italian families were not excluding Harlem out of disrespect. They were following the path of least resistance through infrastructure they controlled. To change this, Johnson would need to change the infrastructure itself, Or more precisely, he would need to make the existing infrastructure more costly to use while simultaneously offering an alternative that was more attractive. This required not confrontation, but coalition building, not demands, but demonstrations of value. Johnson emerged from the subway at 125th Street, and he walked east toward Lenox Avenue, past storefronts and apartment buildings, past people he had known for years. He stopped at a barber shop and spoke briefly with the owner. He stopped at a newsstand and bought a paper. He stopped at a restaurant and ordered coffee. To anyone watching, he was simply a man going about his day, conducting ordinary business in his neighborhood. But each of these stops served a purpose. At the barber shop, he asked the owner to send word to 3 specific men that Johnson needed to meet with them. At the newsstand, he collected information from the owner, who heard everything that happened on that corner. At the restaurant, he left a message with the waitress for someone else who would stop by later. By evening, a network of quiet communication had spread through Harlem. Within 24 hours, and Johnson would meet with the people he needed to begin building his coalition. The first meeting was with Thomas Crawford, who managed the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters' Harlem office. Crawford was 47 years old, a man who had spent 2 decades building the Union into one of the most powerful black labor organizations in the country. The porters worked on trains that moved throughout the eastern United States, which meant they had access to information about shipping schedules, cargo movements, and transportation networks that few other people possessed. Johnson met Crawford at the Union office on West 135th Street. He explained the situation simply. Product was moving through the city along routes that bypassed Harlem, which meant that all the economic activity associated with transportation and logistics was occurring elsewhere. He asked Crawford whether the porters' network might be able to provide information about shipping schedules and cargo movements at the ports. Crawford understood the implication. If Johnson knew when shipments were arriving and how they were being moved, he could anticipate operations and potentially disrupt them or offer alternatives. But Crawford also understood the risks. Providing such information could expose the Union to legal problems and could endanger the porters themselves. Johnson addressed these concerns directly. He was not asking the porters to participate in criminal activity. He was simply asking them to share information that they observed in the normal course of their work. Or they would not be asked to interfere with shipments or to do anything that would compromise their positions. They would simply serve as sources of information, a role that carried minimal risk but provided significant value. Crawford agreed to consider the request and to discuss it with certain trusted members of the Union. He could not promise that information would be available, but he understood why Johnson needed it and recognized that the economic marginalization of Harlem affected everyone in the community, including the porters. The second meeting was with Margaret Henderson, who ran a network of domestic workers throughout Manhattan. These women worked as maids, cooks, and housekeepers in wealthy homes throughout the city, including the homes of police officials, politicians, and business leaders connected to the Italian families. And Henderson was 62 years old, a woman who had built her network over 30 years by being discreet, reliable, and fiercely protective of the women who worked for her. Johnson explained that he needed information about schedules, meetings, and conversations that occurred in certain households. He needed to know when important people were traveling, when they were holding meetings, when they were making decisions. This information would allow him to understand the decision-making processes of the people he needed to influence. Henderson recognized immediately that this was dangerous work. Domestic workers were invisible in many ways, which allowed them to overhear conversations and observe activities that would not occur if their presence was truly acknowledged. But if they were discovered actively gathering information, they would lose their positions and possibly face worse consequences. Johnson addressed this concern by emphasizing that he was not asking anyone to spy in any formal sense. He was simply asking that when women heard things in the natural course of their work, they might remember those things and share them. He would pay well for such information, not as payment for espionage, but as acknowledgment of the value of what they provided. Henderson agreed to speak with certain women who might be willing to participate in such an arrangement. She could not guarantee that information would be forthcoming, but she recognized that economic power required information, and information was one resource that Harlem possessed in abundance if it could be properly organized. The third meeting was with Samuel Washington, who operated a small trucking company in Harlem. Washington owned 5 trucks and employed 12 men. His business consisted primarily of local deliveries, moving furniture, transporting goods between small warehouses, and other routine commercial work. But Washington's trucks had one significant advantage. They were located in Harlem. They were operated by black drivers who knew the neighborhood intimately, and they were not connected to any of the Italian trucking companies that dominated the industry. Johnson explained that he wanted to develop an alternative transportation network that could move product through Harlem rather than around it. This would require trucks that could operate without arousing suspicion, drivers who were loyal and discreet, and routes that took advantage of Harlem's geography rather than avoiding it. Washington understood the opportunity but also the risks. Moving illegal product was a serious crime that could result in the loss of his business and his freedom. But the economic reality was that his small trucking company struggled to compete with the larger Italian operations, which controlled most of the profitable routes and contracts. If Johnson could provide steady work at good rates, it would transform Washington's business from marginal to prosperous. Johnson proposed a specific arrangement. Washington's trucks would be available for legitimate work, as always, but they would also be available for other work if needed, work that would pay significantly better rates. This work would be structured to minimize risk through careful planning and coordination. Washington would not be asked to do anything that exposed him unnecessarily to law enforcement attention. Washington agreed to make his trucks available, understanding that this represented both opportunity and danger, but recognizing that economic opportunity in Harlem often required accepting some degree of risk. Over the next 2 weeks, Johnson held similar meetings with dock workers at the West Side piers, with warehouse operators in Harlem who had unused storage space, with small business owners who could provide cover for various activities, and with community leaders who could provide political cover if problems arose. Each meeting followed the same pattern. Johnson explained what he needed, why he needed it, and how it would benefit both his operations and the broader community. And he addressed concerns about risk directly and honestly. He offered fair compensation for participation, and he emphasized that success would require coordination and discipline, not individual heroism or reckless behavior. The coalition he was building consisted of people who had legitimate businesses and legitimate reasons for their activities, but who were willing to use those legitimate operations to support an alternative network that could compete with the Italian-controlled infrastructure. None of these people were criminals in any traditional sense. They were simply people with resources and access who were willing to coordinate those resources for mutual benefit. While building this coalition, Johnson was also developing his strategy. The goal was not to attack the Italian operations directly, which would be both dangerous and ineffective. The goal was to make those operations more expensive and less reliable while simultaneously offering an alternative that was more attractive. The strategy had three components: information, disruption, and demonstration. Information meant knowing when shipments were arriving, how they were being transported, and where they were going. This information would come from the network of porters, domestic workers, dock workers, and others who had agreed to share what they observed. With this information, Johnson could anticipate operations and plan accordingly. Disruption meant creating problems for the existing route without directly attacking it. This could be accomplished through various means. If Johnson knew when a truck would be traveling through a particular area, then he could arrange for that truck to encounter unexpected delays, construction crews working at inconvenient times, traffic accidents that blocked streets, police checkpoints that appeared randomly. None of these disruptions would be obviously connected to Johnson, but they would add time and uncertainty to operations that depended on efficiency and predictability. Demonstration meant showing that the alternative route through Harlem was not only viable, but superior. This required actually moving product through Harlem successfully, proving that the infrastructure existed and functioned effectively. It required demonstrating that Harlem's routes were faster, more secure, and more reliable than the routes that bypassed the neighborhood. The execution of this strategy began in early April 1948, and the sleeping car porters provided information about a shipment arriving at Pier 54 on April 12th. The shipment was concealed in a load of furniture being imported from France. It would be unloaded at the pier, transferred to trucks, and transported to a warehouse in the Bronx for processing. Johnson used this information to create complications. On the morning of April 12th, a water main broke on 10th Avenue near the pier, flooding the street and creating a traffic jam that delayed trucks leaving the area. This was not an accident. A maintenance worker who was sympathetic to Johnson's network had opened a valve at precisely the right time to create the problem. While trucks sat in traffic waiting for the street to be cleared, dock workers at the pier delayed the loading process by discovering paperwork irregularities that required additional verification. These irregularities were minor and were eventually resolved, but they added another hour to an operation that was supposed to be quick and efficient. When the trucks finally left the pier, they encountered additional delays. A traffic accident on the route to the Bronx blocked traffic for 40 minutes. A police checkpoint on the Triborough Bridge backed up traffic for another 30 minutes. None of these obstacles prevented the trucks from reaching their destination, but they transformed a 2-hour operation into a 6-hour ordeal. Vincent Gallo heard about these delays. He assumed they were simply bad luck, the kind of random complications that occasionally disrupted even well-planned operations. He made a note to review the route and consider alternatives, but he did not change his fundamental approach. 2 weeks later, another shipment arrived. This time, the delays were even more pronounced. A construction crew began working on a street that the trucks needed to use, forcing them to detour through areas where traffic moved slowly. A mechanical problem disabled one of the trucks, requiring a lengthy delay while a replacement vehicle was arranged. Small problems accumulated into significant disruptions. Gallo began to notice a pattern. Operations that should have been routine were becoming complicated and unpredictable. The current route, which had seemed secure and efficient, was proving to be unreliable. This unreliability created problems throughout the distribution network, and delaying deliveries and creating tensions with the people who depended on timely supply. While the existing route was experiencing difficulties, Johnson was demonstrating that an alternative existed. He arranged for a test shipment to move through Harlem using the infrastructure he had assembled. The product arrived at the pier and was transferred to Samuel Washington's trucks. These trucks moved through Harlem streets that Washington's drivers knew intimately, avoiding main thoroughfares and using routes that were invisible to most outside observers. The trucks delivered the product to a warehouse on 145th Street that appeared to be a furniture storage facility, but had been modified to serve as a distribution hub. The product was processed quickly and efficiently, broken down into smaller packages, and distributed to street-level operations throughout Harlem and surrounding areas. The entire operation took 3 hours from pier to final distribution, half the time the Italian route required even under ideal conditions. There were no delays, no complications, no unexpected problems. The demonstration proved that the Harlem route was not only viable, but superior in terms of speed and efficiency. Johnson arranged for word of this success to reach Gallo through intermediaries. He did not present it as a challenge or a threat. He simply made sure that Gallo became aware that an alternative route existed and that it had functioned effectively. Over the next month, the pattern continued. The existing route experienced repeated disruptions while the Harlem route operated smoothly. Each disruption was small and appeared to be coincidental, but collectively they created significant costs. Operations took longer, product was delayed, distributors complained about unreliable supply. The carefully designed system that had seemed so efficient was becoming a source of frustration and expense. Vincent Gallo was a practical man. By June 1948, he recognized that something had changed. The disruptions affecting his operations were too consistent to be random. Someone was creating these problems deliberately, and the most likely candidate was the same person who had demonstrated an alternative route, Bumpy Johnson. Gallo faced a choice. He could respond with force, attempting to shut down Johnson's operations and punish him for interfering with mafia business, or he could treat this as a business problem requiring a business solution. Force would be expensive and uncertain. Johnson operated in Harlem, where he had extensive support and deep knowledge of the territory. Any aggressive action against him would likely trigger a conflict that could last months or years, disrupting operations and drawing law enforcement attention. And even if force succeeded in eliminating Johnson personally, it would not solve the underlying problem. The current route had become unreliable and expensive. A business solution, on the other hand, would acknowledge that Johnson had demonstrated something valuable. He controlled infrastructure in Harlem that could make distribution operations more efficient. He had proven he could move product quickly and securely, and he had shown that he could create problems for operations that tried to exclude him. Gallo made a phone call. The call was answered by someone who knew Johnson and could deliver a message. The message was simple. Vincent Gallo wanted to meet with Bumpy Johnson to discuss distribution arrangements. The meeting would be held on neutral ground at the same restaurant on Mulberry Street where the original meeting had occurred in March. Johnson received this message with no visible reaction. He sent back a reply indicating that he would attend the meeting. He specified a date and time. And he added one additional detail: he would bring information that Gallo would find valuable. The meeting occurred on a Tuesday afternoon in late June. The restaurant was quiet, the lunch crowd having departed. The same corner table near the kitchen was available. Gallo arrived first, along with 2 associates. Johnson arrived 15 minutes later, alone, and they sat across from each other at the table. Gallo began by acknowledging that there had been some difficulties with the current distribution route. He said these difficulties had created costs and complications that were unacceptable. He asked Johnson directly whether he had been responsible for creating these problems. Johnson did not deny it. He explained that he had noticed that the original route bypassed Harlem, which meant that Harlem received none of the economic benefits associated with transportation and distribution. He had decided to demonstrate that an alternative route through Harlem was both possible and preferable. He had done this not to attack Gallo's operations, but to show that a better system existed. Gallo asked what Johnson wanted. Johnson's answer was straightforward. He wanted product to move through Harlem rather than around it. He wanted Harlem to control the transportation and warehousing functions that generated significant economic activity. He wanted his network to handle the logistics from the pier to final distribution. In exchange, he would guarantee that operations would be faster, more secure, and more reliable than the current system. He would also provide something else that the current system did not offer: comprehensive intelligence about law enforcement activities in and around Harlem. His network of community members could identify police surveillance operations before they became problematic. They could provide early warning of investigations or raids. They could help ensure that operations remained protected from law enforcement interference. And this intelligence capability was valuable because it addressed one of the primary risks facing any criminal operation: unpredictable law enforcement action. If Johnson could reliably predict when and where police would focus their attention, he could route operations around those areas, significantly reducing the risk of interdiction or arrest. Gallo considered this proposal. From his perspective, it made practical sense. Johnson had proven he could disrupt the current system, which meant continued conflict would be expensive. He had also proven he could operate an effective alternative system, and the addition of intelligence capabilities would make operations more secure overall. The only cost would be sharing control and profit with Johnson. But that cost was offset by increased efficiency and reduced risk. And the negotiation took 2 hours. They discussed percentages, responsibilities, and protocols. Johnson would control transportation and warehousing in Harlem. He would receive a percentage of the wholesale value of product moving through his infrastructure. He would be responsible for security during transportation and storage. He would provide intelligence about law enforcement activities that might affect operations. In return, the Italian families would maintain control over importation and overall distribution strategy. They would continue to handle relationships with suppliers overseas, and would manage wholesale distribution to other parts of the city beyond Harlem. The arrangement would be exclusive, meaning that Johnson would handle all product moving through Harlem, but he would not expand into other territories without permission. By the end of the meeting, they had reached agreement on the essential terms. Gallo would take the proposal to his superiors for final approval, but he indicated that approval was likely. The arrangement made economic sense and resolved problems that had been creating costs and complications. Johnson left the restaurant understanding that he had accomplished something significant. He had not demanded inclusion through threats. He had not attacked the existing system directly. He had simply demonstrated that an alternative existed, and that continuing to exclude that alternative was more expensive than accepting it. 2 weeks later, the first shipment moved through the new route. Trucks from Samuel Washington's company picked up product at the pier, transported it through Harlem streets to the warehouse on 145th Street, and oversaw processing and distribution. The operation proceeded smoothly, taking less than 3 hours from start to finish. Over the next months, this became the standard procedure. Product moving through New York increasingly flowed through Harlem rather than around it. Samuel Washington's trucking company expanded from 5 trucks to 15. The warehouse on 145th Street employed 30 people. Dock workers who provided information and facilitated smooth loading operations received regular payments. The sleeping car porters continued providing intelligence about shipping schedules and law enforcement activities. The economic impact on Harlem was substantial. The transportation and warehousing operations generated dozens of jobs that paid significantly better than most legitimate employment available to black workers in 1948. And these jobs supported families, allowed people to buy homes, and created a foundation of economic stability that had not existed before. Moreover, the arrangement gave Johnson and his organization genuine power in their relationship with the Italian families. He was no longer simply a local operator who paid tribute. He was an essential partner who controlled infrastructure that the larger organization needed. This changed the balance of power fundamentally. It meant that decisions affecting Harlem required consultation with Johnson rather than being imposed from outside. The intelligence network that Johnson had assembled also proved valuable in ways that extended beyond protecting drug operations. The same network that could identify police surveillance also identified other threats to the community. When outside gangs attempted to move into Harlem, Johnson learned about it quickly. When landlords planned evictions or business owners faced extortion, information flowed to Johnson's organization. When political decisions threatened the neighborhood, advance warning allowed community leaders to organize resistance. In this way, what had begun as an effort to redirect drug smuggling routes became something larger. It became a demonstration that Harlem could control its own economic infrastructure if given the opportunity. It became proof that organization and intelligence could compete successfully with established power structures. It became evidence that black communities could exercise real power in negotiations with white-controlled institutions if they could demonstrate value rather than simply making demands. Vincent Gallo, for his part, recognized that the new arrangement was superior to the old one. Operations ran more smoothly, costs were lower, risks were reduced. The intelligence provided by Johnson's network helped avoid law enforcement problems throughout the New York area, not just in Harlem. What had initially seemed like a loss of control had actually strengthened the overall operation. Other Italian families noticed the success of this arrangement. Over the next several years, similar partnerships developed between the mafia and black operators in other cities. The model that Johnson had pioneered, black control over local infrastructure in exchange for intelligence and efficient operations, spread to Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, and other urban centers where organized crime sought to expand drug distribution. And this was Johnson's legacy from this particular episode. He had not eliminated the drug trade or reformed the criminal justice system. He had not solved the underlying economic problems that made drug trafficking attractive to both operators and users, but he had demonstrated that even within illegal systems, power could be negotiated and redistributed through strategic thinking and careful organization. The phone call that initiated the final negotiation, the message from Gallo requesting a meeting, represented the moment when the opposing power recognized that accommodation was more profitable than continued conflict. That single communication, brief and businesslike, confirmed what Johnson had understood from the beginning. Power came not from noise or violence, but from controlling infrastructure and demonstrating value. When Johnson died in 1968, the distribution network he had established continued functioning. His successors maintained control over transportation and warehousing in Harlem. The economic benefits that flowed from this control continued supporting families and businesses throughout the neighborhood. The intelligence networks continued protecting community interests beyond simply facilitating criminal operations. Historians who later studied organized crime in Harlem often focused on violence and individual personalities. They missed the more significant story: how one man, through careful observation, strategic thinking, and disciplined execution, had redirected economic power flows through his community. They overlooked how he had transformed exclusion into inclusion, not through demands, but through demonstration. The system he created was morally compromised. It facilitated drug distribution that harmed the very community it enriched. The economic benefits it provided came at the cost of addiction, family destruction, and social deterioration. There was no heroism in this story, only pragmatism applied to an immoral enterprise. But within that compromised system, Johnson had demonstrated something important about power itself. He had shown that power structures could be changed without violence if one understood how those structures actually functioned. He had proven that information and organization could compete with established advantages of wealth and political connection. He had illustrated that value creation was more sustainable than value extraction. These lessons extended beyond the criminal world. They applied to labor negotiations, civil rights organizing, economic development, and any situation where communities without formal power sought to improve their position relative to those with established advantages. The method Johnson had used, understanding systems, building coalitions, demonstrating value, negotiating from strength, was a template that others could apply to more legitimate purposes. In the end, the smuggling route that had bypassed Harlem for years was redirected not through a single dramatic phone call, but through weeks of careful preparation that made that phone call inevitable. When Gallo called requesting a meeting, he was acknowledging a reality that Johnson had created through patient strategy. The call was simply the moment when opposing power recognized what Johnson had known from the beginning, that accommodation was more profitable than exclusion, that partnership was more efficient than domination, and that Harlem had resources that made inclusion valuable rather than optional. This was power exercised quietly, strategically, and effectively. It changed not just individual outcomes, but systemic arrangements. It transformed Harlem's position within the larger criminal economy from marginal to central. And it did so through intelligence and organization rather than through noise or force. The legacy persisted long after Johnson's death. The model he established, local control over infrastructure in exchange for efficiency and intelligence, became standard practice in organized crime distribution networks. More broadly, his approach influenced how black communities negotiated with external power structures, demonstrating that strategic value creation could accomplish what demands and confrontation could not. There was no celebration, no public acknowledgement, no recognition of what had been accomplished. The system continued functioning as systems do, processing product, generating profit, supporting some while destroying others, but the route had been redirected. Harlem had claimed its place in the infrastructure, and that change, achieved through strategy rather than force, endured.